So I'll give an introduction and then we'll hand things over to our facilitators for this evening. So welcome. My name is Jen Higgins-Newman and I am the program director here at Beacon Hill Friends House, where I live and work. The Friends House is a Quaker center for learning and action and a residential community of about 20 people who live according to Quaker values. This is MIDWEEK, Experiments in Faithfulness. So it's a weekly facilitated spiritual practice with a Quaker flavor and an experimental ethos. And tonight we have an experiment on top of an experiment because we are experimenting with having residents who live here in the Friends House be live in person in our parlor, and our facilitators live in person in our parlor, and some other folks on Zoom joining us in the sort of corner of our parlor room. So this is exciting, and thank you for bearing with us. I will now tell you what our practice is this evening. So tonight we have my friends Egan and Jeff, who will be leading us in a practice called the Poetic Spirit of Mary Oliver. So Mary Oliver, who lived between 1935 and 2019 and is one of the most widely beloved American poets of the 21st century, used natural beauty of Cape Cod as a source of spiritual insight. So tonight we're going to read her poetry, share what it evokes in us, and use creative exercises to enter the meditative space that Mary Oliver creates. Now I'm going to introduce Egan and Jeff and then hand things over to them. So Egan Millard is a poet and journalist. His poetry has been published in anthologies in Alaska and New England. Currently, he lives in Boston and works as an assistant editor and writer for the Episcopal News Service. And Jeff Edenberg is the Residency and Operations Director here at Beacon Hill Friends House.
Well, welcome again. Thank you, Jen, for the intro. To give you a little bit of our rundown for the day, but I'm kind of like the tour guide for the evening, and Egan's going to be the content master. So that's sort of our roles here today. So what's going to look like, Egan's going to give some introductory remarks on sort of what role poetry has in his spiritual life, and what role spirituality has in his poetry. Give some more remarks about Mary Oliver. And then we're going to, together, we're going to read through two poems, and on each of those poems, after we read them, we'll have some time to sit in reflection. We'll give some prompts, and that reflection can be, you'll have many options for that reflection, and there'll be enough time if you need to gather things to be active during that. You'll be able to do so as well. And then we'll just simply have some time at the end to share with each other. So real simple. That's what our evening will look like. I am sort of talking to the room and to this screen here, so I can see all your faces, even if I'm not addressing straight at this camera. I'm looking at you all. Egan.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Jen. Thanks all for being here. I have been really interested in poetry for a very long time, and I think a lot of people who are not super into poetry in an academic or an intensive way feel a connection to Mary Oliver. I think she's often described as an accessible poet, and I think that's a great thing because as much as there is to experience in the poetry world beyond accessibility, she's a great way to sort of expand your idea of what words can do in your life. So poetry has long had a connection to spiritual life, basically from the time it was created, going back to, in my Judeo-Christian tradition, all the way back to the Psalms, through writers like Dante, Hopkins, Donne, through someone like Emily Dickinson, who I think is very close to Mary Oliver, actually, in terms of content. Mary Oliver is part of that tradition, writing as an Episcopalian in the Christian tradition, but also not being really specific about that tradition for the most part. In a couple of poems, she gets pretty specific in terms of Christian context, but for the most part, it's really about spiritual connection with nature or through nature. I get a lot out of her poetry and other poets like her, because I like to feel connected to something larger than myself. That's why I read poetry. That's why I write poetry. Poetry for me is transcendence. It's an ability to be free from the cerebral overthinking that I am really prone to. And I bet many of you are as well. It, I think, often gets mistaken for something that's supposed to be really cerebral and analytical. And I think partly it's been really taught wrong in the last couple of decades. Poetry is supposed to be a sensual pleasure, and it can lead to other kinds of, connection with the spiritual world or intellectual ideas. But in the most basic sense, it's meant to be pleasurable to hear and to kind of play with in your mouth, in your ears, in your mind. So I love to read and write poetry because it gives me permission to speak and feel grounded in pure sensation, much like I am, and I think many people are, in encounters with nature and in prayer, entering a different space that's set apart from our daily lives. And so I will introduce Mary Oliver with a quote from her poem, Winter Hours. I am sensual in order to be spiritual. I think that kind of sets the tone for her work. Mary Oliver grew up loving nature as a child in Ohio, and even more so after she moved to Provincetown in the 1960s. So Provincetown here on Cape Cod in Massachusetts is kind of the end of the world. It's a unique landscape in terms of these huge dunes rolling out to the sea, marshes, ocean beaches, and little inlets and things. It's really a unique landscape. But she focused on that landscape, especially the lesser known parts of it, these kind of little forests and ponds back in what's now the Cape Cod National Seashore, that are not the spectacular vistas that Provincetown is known for. She really preferred to focus on those really quiet spots. As for her writing process, she said this: every day, a little conversation with God or his envoy, the tall pine or the grass swimming cricket. People always asked her whether because she was writing so much about nature, she really was a nature poet. People would ask her how she could focus for so long, for so many decades, on this one place, on Provincetown, which is a really small place. And she said, people say to me, wouldn't you like to see Yosemite, the Bay of Fundy, the Brooks Range? I smile and answer, oh yes, sometime, and go off to my woods, my ponds, my sun-filled harbor, no more than a blue comma on the map of the world, but to me, the emblem of everything. So she's not really focused on the most grand or spectacular aspects of the natural experience, but really on the kind of everyday experiences that you can really have anywhere that there's a little bit of green space. So that's another way that she's pretty accessible. So I will move on to reading our first poem. I Happen to Be Standing by Mary Oliver. I don't know where prayers go or what they do. Do cats pray while they sleep half asleep in the sun? Does the opossum pray as it crosses the street? The sunflowers, the old black oak growing older every year? I know I can walk through the world along the shore or under the trees with my mind filled with things of little importance, in full self-attendance, a condition I can't really call being alive. Is a prayer a gift or a petition, or does it matter? The sunflowers blaze, maybe that's their way. Maybe the cats are sound asleep, maybe not. While I was thinking this, I happened to be standing just outside my door with my notebook open, which is the way I begin every morning. Then a wren in the privet began to sing. He was positively drenched in enthusiasm. I don't know why. And yet, why not? I wouldn't persuade you from whatever you believe or whatever you don't. That's your business. But I thought of the wren singing, what could this be if it isn't a prayer? So I just listened, my pen in the air. So what jumped out at you when you hear or read this poem? Don't think too much about being analytical or trying to figure out the meaning or whatever. Just without thinking too much about it, what's an image or a word or phrase or just a sound or a feeling that you get when you hear this poem?
Yes.
So Mary Oliver writes about prayer from an interesting perspective. She's often refers to prayer in the context of animals and nature, very rarely referring to it in a religious setting, but often talking about it as a spontaneous expression or a sort of random encounter with something, or even as silence. She really, in her work, tries to redefine what a prayer means and what it can be. And this poem is really all about that, asking questions about what we think about what we mean when we say prayer. So, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. So what we're going to ask you to do is just take some time, maybe around like 10 minutes. That might feel long, but it's a good long time to feel uncomfortable and move through that if you're not used to a lot of silence. We're going to ask you to take some time to reflect on many forms of prayer, be that like planned, spontaneous, in silence, in sound, perhaps even sacred, secular. And during this reflection, you have some options, some offerings. It's a choose your own adventure. So offering you could write, if you're someone who writes, journal, you could draw, you could doodle, you can move, you can, if you're on Zoom, you can, since you're muted, you can make sounds. If you're in the room, please don't make sounds. That'll be too disturbing. Or you are also welcome to simply sit in reflective silence if that is a practice that works for you.
Yeah, so as this poem sort of redefines prayer by looking at it from a totally different perspective, how might you, in your thoughts and in your life, redefine prayer?
Goodbye, Fox. He was lying under a tree, licking up the shade. Hello again, Fox, I said.
And hello to you too, said Fox, looking up and not bounding away.
You're not running away, I said.
Well, I've heard of your conversation about us. News travels even among foxes, as you might know or not know.
What conversation do you mean?
Some lady said to you, the hunt is good for the fox. And you said, which fox?
Yes, I remember. She was huffed.
So you're okay in my book.
Your book? That was in my book. That's the difference between us.
Yes, I agree. You fuss over life with your clever words, mulling and chewing on its meaning, while we just live it.
Oh.
Could anyone figure it out to a finality? So why spend so much time trying? You fuss, we live.
And he stood, slowly, for he was old now, and ambled away.
So I'll ask again what stood out for you in that poem? A word, a phrase, a feeling, anything that just stuck in your mind. I'll say one thing that keeps sticking with me every time I read this poem is actually in the last line where he was old now, which is an interesting line. It's kind of surreal in a way. I'm not sure whether she's meaning that the fox was already old or that this conversation has somehow made him old. It's very mysterious, and that's why I like it. So cool, thanks everyone for sharing. The technique that Mary Oliver is using here is, you could call it anthropomorphization. You could also call it just a conversational poem. The poet is obviously imagining a conversation with a nonverbal animal. So, and you can also tell from the way the conversation is going, she's kind of both imagining the fox kind of congratulating her for defending foxes or sticking up for foxes. So in a way, she's pleasing herself. but then the fox is also kind of challenging her, also pointing out, how much she overthinks things and fusses about things and makes judgments, or however you want to interpret that. So that's one thing I really love about this poem, is that technique of having an imaginary conversation with an animal. So for this exercise, sorry.
It's yellow highlight.
It's yellow.
So yeah, for this, we're just going to ask that you imagine yourself in conversation with a natural element. So that could be an animal, a plant, or some other natural being. As before, you can write, draw, journal, doodle, or sit in reflective silence for about the same amount of time as before, and then we'll come back for some sharing and reflection to end our evening together.
Yeah, so just kind of let yourself get lost in it. Don't be afraid to be silly. Have a conversation with a natural, inanimate, or animate object.